When
Okay.
someone asks me to do something that's not in my job description, how do I tell them that politely? Or how can I ask for something without seeming demanding?
Yeah, good questions, because I think we're all kind of, especially when we're new, we're really trying to balance. I need to stick up for myself, respect myself, get what I need and be a professional. But of course, I'm also building these relationships for the first time. And we often talk in writing workshops about how our relationships actually grow through writing today, because, it's really great right now. I'm getting to talk to Emma, but a lot of our relationship has happened through email as we go back and forth in our work together. And so, your friends are really having a good instinct there, where I have to preserve this relationship with the person I'm writing to, but I also have to stick up for myself at the same time. So a few tips you could try. Number one, letting the person know what your area is. This week I've been asked to work on X and Y. My supervisor has assigned me to this project. We can put the sort of, not the blame, but the responsibility on that internal structure. We can say, here's an idea about what we could do instead. You could consider asking this person, you could consider going on this website. And then I often, in any kind of sort of possible conflict situation, I suggest that we be really careful with two areas of our language. The first one is the word you. If you're saying something back to that person, be careful with how you use you, because we know the word you can sound like this. So we don't want to say, well, since you asked, or when you asked me, or because you, blah, blah, blah. Be careful about that. I use the word you when it's a happy situation, and I use it a little less when it's a worrisome situation. And then secondly, try to keep your response using what I call productive language. So instead of like, because you didn't give me this, I can't do that, we can say, when I receive this, I will be able to do that. And so there's often just a reframe that you can use in those situations to still respect yourself while respecting your colleague or supervisor.
I feel like everything I write is not as good as my peers, but I also feel like my peers always try to sound smart in their writing, which limits their audience. Do you have any advice for me?
I sure do. That's a really insightful thing to bring up, actually. There's, I think, kind of a cultural shift going on with a lot of the people that I work with. If I'm working with, say, a state agency or a business, people within it will have different points of view about how sort of fancy our language should be. I believe, and so do many people who work with the public or work, for our community, that it's actually better to use language that everyone can understand. And so, that part of your question that was like, if we use kind of higher vocabulary, we might also narrow our audience a bit, because they would need to know those words and have that background in the field. So even though there might be that temptation left over from school to use a big vocabulary and sound smart and sort of decorative writing, that was rewarded in school, right? We were told, be descriptive, use good vocab, write a lot of words. So we have it in our heads that that's rewarded, but it's really not rewarded now, because business readers just want to be able to get the information as easily as possible and without the chance for misinterpretation. So you're actually better off using plain, simple words. Instead of we modified the process, we changed the process. It's okay to use regular words like we would in real life. It's actually what readers want in their daily lives at work.
I struggle with balancing the formality and casualness of emails. I feel like I always err on the side of too formal, even when people on my team aren't, because I'm scared of being seen as too casual or not professional.
Yeah, that's another good question, where, again, we're trying to represent ourselves through our writing. So we want to be authentic and be our authentic selves, but then we also want to make sure that we're writing in a way that's going to work for our reader, which, yeah, it often comes down to that formality. And I've been in that situation too. Usually what I'll do is I'll start formal, and as I get to know my reader, I'll reduce some of that based on what I've learned from them. we can often do a little bit of mirroring. We can see what their style is. We can even observe people in meetings, not just in writing, and see kind of how they talk to one another and learn a little bit about the cultural norms of the group. And then you can kind of try to write to those cultural norms. But I think it's a smart question, because even though formal seems good in general, and I think it is, like when in doubt, use the polite and the respectful ways of writing. But it's also true that formality runs a risk, right? Because it can kind of depersonalize and create distance between the writer and the reader. So I'd say as soon as you feel like it's safe to be less formal, go ahead and make those moves little by little, because that's how you can break through and create a friendship with your reader, or a relationship, right? Where you're getting to know each other as human beings. So look for those opportunities, after the first week or so of writing with somebody, and kind of like, well, what could I maybe show about myself? And then see if they'll show something back, and work with it just like you would a friendship in person, where, the first time you go out with a new friend, you're kind of like, what's okay to talk about? But you figure out that relationship as you go. And it's kind of similar in writing, I think. And, when you were describing like, where are they from and everything, I'm thinking this is really an intercultural question, right? How formal can we be in different cultures and subcultures? And so I would just add on one more thought there. When you're trying to decide how formal to be, consider the culture of your industry too. Something like banking has a fairly formal culture. Some nonprofits that I work with have a less formal culture. So it's going to depend where you're at. Like writing is always circumstantial.
Do male and female young professionals face the same issues with writing when they enter the professional workforce?
That's such an interesting question, right? And I know we're working with gender at the forefront of a lot of our work, making sure of respectful ways to talk to people and about people. And we're more open about gender difference and gender bias in the workforce too. So I think it's on people's minds when they write. I have a couple ideas, and I'd love to see, how you feel like your group and generation would respond to this. I've been doing some leadership development programs with emerging leaders lately, and they tend to be maybe around in their 30s and 40s. And I've noticed in talking with them, when we talk about writing to build relationships or community, gender does come into the mind of the writer sometimes. I've noticed some of the men in my classes saying that they want to write to their team in a way that builds motivation, but that they don't sound like the old school hierarchical situation that we all grew up seeing in the movies on Wall Street or whatever. And some men are kind of worried, what if, my stereotype is gonna be there and people will think I'm being like that when I'm really trying to be collaborative. So they try to make moves in their writing to, use the word we to talk about new ideas and just show that they're collaborative. And then women, on the other hand, are, I think, also worried about their own stereotypes, where in a work situation, a woman could get stereotyped as being emotional, apologetic, not getting credit or not taking credit. And so when we write, we might be thinking, well, I don't want to accidentally reduce myself in my words. And so I think whoever we are, we're a little bit aware of our stereotype, and we're trying to make sure that we don't bring any kind of gender problems to our teams.
And another one that just popped in my head is passive aggressiveness in emails.
Yeah.
Because that's not something I tend to be more direct, but perhaps if you're trying to word something in a more polite way, or even phrasing something negative in a more polite way, it could come across as passive aggressive, which can be so nuanced and so difficult to understand, because maybe that wasn't the intention.
Often it's just gender conditioning, right? Where we've been taught to be more direct than some, less direct than others. And when we're in our teams, we have to remember our teammates also got conditioned in their genders. So they've been taught to be perhaps very direct if they're male and more indirect if they're female. They may have been taught those things. So we have to give some kind of latitude and grace as people work through this. I think men have been pressured to be ambitious and achieve, and women have been pressured to collaborate and support. And so we see those both come into play in a team, where a woman might write I'm waiting to hear on other people's opinions because it's good to be collaborative and we need everybody's buy-in, but that might look to someone else like not strong. Whereas a male might, if they go forward with their conditioning and pressure to achieve, it might look like they're not collaborating. So we're all kind of doing this dance. And I think the best thing we can do is sort of assume benevolent intent when we read what each other has written, and to have these conversations together as a team.
Do you have any maybe final advice for maybe university graduates that are entering the professional workforce? What might be one or two final pieces of advice you would give them?
There is not one right way to write. So, if you've been told that there is, it's just not true. It always depends on the circumstance, the reader, and the situation, right? But I think when we're in school, we can feel like, oh, I'm the wrong one. But that's not the case, because nobody is right except the person who's in the situation and knows how to analyze the situation and make writing decisions in response, because we'll write differently every time, which leads to my second piece, which is that you can make almost any writing decision you need to by thinking about who's my reader and what's my goal. Now, in school, my reader was my teacher, and I knew they were going to read it no matter what because they had to. And my goal was to show what I know and to show that I did it right. Now, our reader is a busy person who has tons of emails and may or may not finish our email or whatever it is. And our goal is to convey information while also managing good relationships. So just keep in mind, you have a whole different goal and reader now, and usually nobody points that out. So it can really be surprising in the workforce. So keep that in mind. You can answer your own questions, but by thinking about who's your new reader and what's your new goal. I hope we've been able to provide people with some helpful insights as you start your professional career or return to the professional sphere.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Erin, for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Bye, everybody. We'll see you soon. Thanks for being here.